thank you to this episode of the Love Procurement Podcast. My name is Kelly Barner, and I'll be your host for this conversation. Today, I'm glad to welcome Alex Saric, Chief Marketing Officer at Ivalua, and Joe Yacura, Senior Advisor at the MIT Chief Data Officer Information Quality Problem. So, hi, Alex. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Now, Joe, we're excited to have sort of a new title for you in this podcast. So maybe let me start with you. Tell us a little bit more about your professional experience, especially around data quality, a topic we're going to spend some time on today.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. My experience has been, I've been fortunate to work for some large financial institutions as Senior Vice President and Chief Procurement Officer, also some hospitality industries. And most recently, I've kind of navigated into academia and created an organization that's focused on data and try to help people understand how to use it. And then most recently, I've been honored being invited to be a senior advisor at MIT for their Chief Data Officer Information Quality Program. So my whole career has been primarily in the supply chain space, but always looking to use and figure out how to use data better. And now focusing on data in a much broader sense as it's becoming a critical asset for most organizations throughout the world. And we now have some great tools, technology, Ivalua being one of them. Now we have to make sure the data that goes into those systems is accurate and appropriate.
And given that you've worked in these different spaces, Joe, one quick question for you that we're actually putting to everybody that joins us on the show. What is something that you love about procurement?
I think the best thing about procurement in my mind is you touch all aspects of the business. If you're in finance or accounting or product development, you kind of narrow. I mean, in supply chain, you're involved with everything: finance, product development, quality, distribution, manufacturing, customer response. Ultimately, you get feedback from that. And you're dealing with outside third parties constantly. Yeah. So you're dealing with a wide breadth of internal customers and a wide breadth of external suppliers. So it's always exciting. It's always changing. It's very dynamic. So, and you can make a significant influence in the organization that you support by doing a great job in supply chain management. So it's always been exciting. I've enjoyed it my whole career.
Well, it probably goes without saying to everybody listening in today, there's no such thing as a dull day in procurement, right, Alex? So let's learn a little bit more about your background. Share something with us about your professional journey up to this point.
Sure. So I've actually spent over 20 years in different leadership roles at spend management technology providers. So I've been on the technology side. That included managing delivery, managing product, and more recently, managing marketing. It's been a great opportunity. I've personally worked with over 100 different companies. So I had the opportunity to really see a lot of different approaches. And particularly in the last 7 years in marketing at Ivalua, the nice thing about marketing is you get to work with a lot of the most innovative, creative, successful companies. So you really get to see an interesting perspective.
Awesome. And what's something you love about procurement?
There are a lot of things. I actually jumped out for 1 year and left the procurement technology space to go in a kind of a flashier side of technology. And after a year, I came back. And it was really because I missed procurement people. I like working with kind of, down-to-earth, smart folks that are solving real problems. And geez, you see it on the front page of the paper every day, unfortunately, for years now. I think they just have a good approach. They really pull different parties together. And on top of that, the technology is really innovating very quickly, and it just continued to do so for a long time. So it's been exciting.
Absolutely. Well, don't even think about leaving again. Anybody that leaves typically finds their way back. We're glad you found your way back so quickly. Now, as we start to think, especially Alex, about your reference to the headlines and some of the news that we start to see, as well as Joe, your points about all of the different areas of a business that procurement has an opportunity to impact. Data, I think, is one common element in all of that, whether it's challenge or opportunity. So, Joe, when we speak generally about data quality issues or data challenges, what are some examples of the specific things that people are talking about?
Yeah, well, we all hear about data in our daily lives and on the news and media. And as Alex referred to here a few minutes ago, we started to hear about supply chain after COVID. When would you ever hear about supply chain on the national news, right? And typically you'd hear it 2 or 3 times, 2 or 3 stories, et cetera,
Yeah.
because of shortages throughout the world. One of the things that I think we need to start thinking about in supply chain, even greater, obviously we're thinking about it, we have been thinking about it for a long time, but even focusing greater, is data is an incredible asset. And in my view, an organization has the 2 top assets are the people and then the data. Technology, financial support, all those can be acquired. But data, when you look at companies now, everything we're trying to do is a different perspective than we did even 4 or 5 years ago. Data before was used primarily to report an event that had happened in the past. And the accuracy was important. I'm not trying to downplay it, but it was less important. If you were off a little bit, what happened last month or last year or last quarter, okay, it may not reflect the absolute truth or actual facts of what occurred, but it wasn't going to affect necessarily your future. And now when we're trying to put a different priority on using data to do predictive analysis and help us decide what we're going to do going forward, whether it be tomorrow, a week, a month, or a year from now, that puts a whole different criticality on the data. And right now, most organizations, and there's many, many studies are ongoing from many, many consulting organizations, show that data is still not trusted by most senior executives. And when I say most, the studies show 60% or so, 60, 70%, whatever. It's more than half of senior executives in most organizations still don't absolutely trust the data. The data is used to support a decision-making process, but it's not used solely. And organizations, because of the massive amounts of data we now have access to, really need to get to what's termed data-driven decision-making, where the systems make the decision for us without human intervention. So there's a lot going on. Data is an asset. We have to look at it. We have to measure it. We have to quantitate. It's hard to quantify.
Yeah.
When you look at organizations, many organizations without their data don't exist. And you think of how they're using data. So they're using data differently.
Now, one of the things, and it's interesting, Joe, that you talk about the vast amounts of data. Alex, one of the challenges actually may be that this enormous amount of data we have access to makes it very hard to see the data that we need but don't have access to. It's like trying to find something that's missing is a whole different kind of challenge. Do you find from your conversations with companies and procurement teams that procurement has access to data and it becomes a quality or an analytical struggle? Or are there cases where they don't have all of the data that they need to even start that quality journey?
So it does vary a little bit, but I'd say broadly, there's the quality aspect, and I think Joe touched on a lot of that, and then there's the access. And I think the access is probably the most uniform challenge, particularly, as you mentioned, the fact that in light of how much data has proliferated these days, it's not just that there's more information, but there's so many different types of information that especially procurement supply chain leaders have to use to balance different priorities that they're dealing with between risk and multiple ESG factors and compliance, all these. So there's so much information. So they inevitably have to go and get information from multiple sources. And obviously it's the supplier themselves, internal information, but also third parties that are specializing in these different niche categories, whether it's risk monitoring or confirming they don't have child labor in their supply chains, what have you. So that by itself creates issues on how you can access all the information, and especially when you need to make kind of a holistic view and look at more than one factor to make a decision. And then on top of that, most organizations still have exacerbated it by their approach towards data and technology. So the data is not accessible in one place. They've got one system for their contracts. They have 5 different records for the same suppliers spread out among 7 different ERPs in the back end. So all this really makes it very difficult to get the information that they need when and where they actually need it. And that to me is the biggest challenge. And we're kind of a victim of the success of all this extra information that we have and all the extra priorities and objectives that procurement has. is it just so much more difficult to have that 360-degree view and be able to optimize your decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I could just amplify a
course.
little bit what Alex mentioned is, this studies show that most business decisions today are made with 6 or 7 sources of data. And as Alex alluded, these data are different timeframes, they're out of sync, they have different definitions of units of measure or units of cost. So to put all these things together in as close to real time as the organization can or can't make decisions, it's very difficult. So we're overloaded. Also, studies show that only about 5% of the data that's collected by most organizations is ever used.
Wow.
So we're collecting massive amounts of data because it's very cost effective. It doesn't cost much. You have all these sensors throughout the processes and machinery and things of that nature. It's collecting data, some cases in every second, milliseconds. We don't know what to do with it, and it's overwhelming. So that's one of the big challenges, I think, in not only the supply chain but anyone. It's what decision are you trying to make? Get clarity on that. Get clarity on the data that's relevant to that decision, and then somehow mine through it in a efficient and effective way that you can make a decision. Because again, data collection is all in support of a decision at some point in time.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I know you mentioned, Joe, that you spent time in business, in academia. And so you've sort of seen different, let's say, urgency levels, right? A business will end up in a situation where, ready or not, it's time to go. Whereas, not always, but sometimes in academia, you can wait, there's more testing, there might be less pressure to make a very quick decision.
Yeah.
What sort of advice would you offer around sort of this balance of wanting to do a very good job and be good data stewards and pulling all the different data inputs that are needed, but at the end of the day, recognizing that at some point it is going to be pencils down and it's going to be time to go? Any practical advice, given the fact that you've sort of had one foot in both of these worlds, around how to make the best of a challenging situation when it comes to data-driven decision-making?
Yeah, well, I would not put academia as leading edge in quick decision-making by any means. So we put that off to the side. I think businesses in today's world, obviously everybody's under pressure, right? Competition, speed. We never had the need for speed in decision-making. Customer preferences change dynamically. I mean, think about it. We've had, you started seeing dynamic pricing in airlines a few years ago. Then you saw it moving into hotels. And now we're even seeing some food chains, fast food chains are changing the price of a hamburger based on the hour of the day, based on the demand that they project, right? I mean, so these things are changing quickly. The thing is, I think people want to always have more data. I'm not sure they understand what they're going to do with it. And I'm not sure they understand the urgency. Most organizations can't make quick decisions, whether they be profit, nonprofit. There's a hierarchy, usually a chain of command, and it depends whether if that decision is a tactical decision and has minimal impact, okay, maybe it be done quicker. If it's more of a strategic decision, it could be a lengthy process. Yeah. So there's a cost associated with collecting real-time data and analyzing and interpreting it. So I think we have to sit back and say, okay, as an organization, and there's no right or wrong, but as an organization, when we have either a tactical decision, how quickly can we make the decision? Get the right people involved, get the right opinions. That's why it's so important to try to move towards this, data-driven decision-making, which would be automated for maybe at least starting with tactical decisions where there's low risk, but the decision could be made by systems that have predefined parameters and you trust the data. So again, I think I wouldn't hold academia as an area that has a great example for decision-making speeds. But businesses are challenged. And again, everybody wants more data quicker, but can we use it in a way that's efficient and effective?
And can we keep it safe? Alex, we've had some conversations about getting data, doing analysis, making sure the data is of sufficient quality to make the best decisions we can. But Gosh, these are tough days to be in IT. If you're on an InfoSec team and you're tasked with guarding this data, and especially as Joe pointed out, some of it's flowing through different systems, maybe it's being enriched, you're pulling things in directly from suppliers in some cases where there's the possibility for exposure. As procurement starts to focus not just on the quality of the data itself, but the data flows and the governance models that are built around that, is there an opportunity for procurement to either make IT's job easier or partner with IT sort of in this fight against the risk that often accompanies data?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is a common factor, I'd say, among some of our most successful customers, is that we see IT working very closely with procurement. And actually, a lot of times, our primary contact and the primary driver is actually an IT director, or even in some cases, the CIO, even more so than procurement, because they're so involved. Often they're co-located with procurement. So I think we're going to see more of that in the future because there are a lot of benefits, and particularly with generative AI, it opens other questions as well.
Yeah.
And you do want to have kind of a company-wide policy guidance. You don't want every department taking their completely own approach because that does make it hard to monitor. But yes, procurement can definitely do a few things. And in some cases, especially with like data quality, even there, one thing that's often overlooked until after companies make a decision on technology, and then many of our customers will realize, oh, we can do that too, is you can actually use your procurement technology systems to help with master data management. So we have customers like Whirlpool, Chassis Brake, now part of Hitachi Automotive, that have 20 some ERPs spread around the world, multiple records, and they actually use us as the master, where we will not only be the single source of truth, we like to say the golden record for the data, so it's all in one single place. But if there is a duplicate, if there is a problem, they'll define an approval workflow, and if they confirm that this should in fact be changed, it will actually bidirectionally sync and fix the issues and override them in the backend systems. So everything is linked together, and it reduces the amount of integrations between different systems. It reduces the amount of duplicates that exist, the amount of places that you really have to watch because you have the single source of truth. So it really does solve a problem that often for IT is a 7 or 8 figure project that they have to handle just to deal with duplicates and some of this master data issues around suppliers and items.
Yeah. Kelly, if I could just comment on
Sure.
the first part of your question, there was I think the supply chain can do a lot with our suppliers to help IT security. We can ask our suppliers and critical suppliers to review their governance, right? Do they even have a data governance policy in place? Do they have control over who has access once an employee leaves? How quickly do they remove those individuals from access to their systems? How often do they require their employees to change passwords, right? All these things are requests that we could make as supply chain management people to our supplier network, because as we know, every company or every organization has hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers who have access to their networks. And we need to put some sort of safeguards in place for those individuals who do have access to that. But going back to the final comment that Alex made was, this single source of trusted data, and I put in quotes, trusted, that's so critical. And when you have, like Alex said, 20 some ERP systems, and you have silos of data, and then you have, data on servers, then data that's on people's desktops that are, it's like, who even knows what's where anymore? And when you use the data, one of the things I think is really critical, going back to Alex's comment about this trusted source, is hopefully you can have a history of the lineage of the data. Because in many cases, we're using data that we don't know exactly where it may have come from. And is it a subset of a subset that was designed or assembled a month ago, where data is no longer relevant? I mean, we just don't have the lineage. And when you have that single source, a trusted source, that lineage typically is there, and you can go back and see where it came from and how it was modified by who and when and for what purposes.
And I think that becomes even more interesting as we start to think about wisely attempting to repurpose data in new and advantageous ways. So, Alex, it's interesting because Joe brings up the point that, sometimes data gets created not by mistake, right? But it's not the goal of a transaction. The data is the byproduct. And in certainly most cases, it's not created with any forward-looking plan in mind. So as procurement now starts to get very excited about different forms of AI, different ways to use this data that was created through other transactions by other systems, or maybe brought in through enrichment, what sort of a mindset do we need to have around, okay, I have this resource in the form of data that was created in all different kinds of ways, but I'm hoping to put it through AI. It certainly gives us an incentive to focus on the quality of that data. But what are some of the things that procurement needs to be maybe asking, maybe thinking about, sort of to Joe's point about provenance? What do we need to understand about the data before we try to use it for something else?
Yeah, I think it brings up like a really good point. We hardly needed a reason to ensure that data was a high quality, but the AI makes it even more important, both today in terms of getting a higher quality from the output. And there was actually an MIT study from a couple of years ago that tested different AI algorithms against different data sets. And they found that even mediocre algorithms worked better in models if they had higher quality data than better quality models working off of lower quality data. So it's extremely important. And I think there are a few things that really have to be factored in. One is the data needs to be as much as possible linked together, because AI output is far superior when there's more information, it has more data that it can refer to. So again, when you have duplicates and data splinter, the AI is going to struggle in most cases to really pull it together to get the best output. So we really need to think how we can actually capture everything together. As AI becomes more part of our daily process, reducing latency and ensuring that we're not doing a end of day or end of month batch into a system, but it's being captured in real time is really important. And that's going to impact both the quality of the output that you'll get, and it's not just good or bad, but the level of detail that the AI model can provide now. And I think going forward, I suspect we're going to see a lot of organizations building their own large language models rather than just relying on third parties. And once you start doing that, you're going to need good quality data to train them. So if you don't have that base, if the data is not linked, if the quality is not there, if it's not complete, you're going to have a really hard time. So it's going to become much more important in the future. It's already really important, but if you can, it'll go even more.
Yeah. I love the fact that you use the word splintered. I think that's a great way to describe what sometimes ends up happening with data. Just like procurement talks about maverick or rogue spending, and we've tried to retrain ourselves. Listen, that distributed buyer did not set out to make your day harder or create a problem for you, right? They probably didn't know. And in many ways, we're inadvertently doing the same thing with data. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to create a data silo. I'm going to put up a wall between me and this other great data resource inside the company. But because we're thinking about process or other business objectives, it happens without us realizing it. Alex, what are some of the common ways that companies either mistakenly create data silos or, allowed to use your word, allow data splinters to form so that you don't have that cohesive set?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes, and interestingly enough, I think it has become worse because of cloud computing, where a lot of the decision making on IT has devolved from the central IT function to the businesses, and that's had a lot of benefits and certainly allow businesses to be more nimble and address their needs. But I think it actually has led to a lot more decisions being made in silos, kind of with blinders on. I have a problem. I need to solve this. And I'm not thinking about the broader implications. I need to manage my contract, so I'm going to get a contract management solution without thinking that it's really important that that system is actually tied to the catalogs, to the orders, to the invoices, if we want max efficiency, if we want everything to be synced. Or I have a new risk factor, so I found this provider that has information on that, and I need that, so I'm going to access this third-party solution or source of information without thinking of how can I pull that in, because someone else needs to consider that along with cost and quality and performance and other factors. So a lot of it really comes from these siloed decisions that are being made without considering the broader implications. And I think a lot of times we take a step forward and we take another step back without knowing it.
Yeah.
And it's really led to the splintering, as you say. And the problem is it's sometimes technology providers can feed that as well. Because even if you talk about, well, I'll buy a suite, and these days everyone has an integrated suite. Well, a lot of times those suites were just a bunch of companies that were acquired and patched together, and they still have separate records for the suppliers. And you still have to go to a separate reporting aspect to pull it together, where you hope that the records are being matched correctly, but a good chunk of the time they're not. So you have to be really careful and look under the covers with technology and make sure that you're thinking about the data implications when you're making decisions.
Yeah. And as we start to think about those data implications, Joe, I think you're uniquely well suited to answer this next point. We can't just think about the business challenge we're faced with or the piece of data or the set of data that's in front of us. We need to be at times stepping back and just thinking about data.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for procurement teams? And whether it's a procurement data strategy or it's an enterprise data strategy that procurement plays a critical role in, how can we step back and just think about the data and ensure that the proper care and thought is going into what I think we've established today is an incredibly important resource?
Yeah, I think a simple beginning step is assign someone the responsibility for data for the supply chain function as a full-time job. When I go into an organization and I usually ask one of the first questions, like, who's in charge of your data? Sometimes you get a blank stare, and sometimes you get, majority of the time you say it's IT. Well, yes, IT is responsible for collecting, storing, controlling access, but they're not there to validate the accuracy or relevance of the data. That's not their charter. And so we need to start looking at this and put a resource against it. And that individual, he or she, would be responsible for starting things like data audits, establishing a data governance if it doesn't exist at the company level, and you can take advantage of it. So all these things, again, you need to have somebody who's held accountable, who has the knowledge and expertise. That person will be totally overwhelmed because the task is huge. But you have to start somewhere. And unless somebody's accountable and can start to look at the data, the sources of the data, the validity, the relevance of the decisions where that data is used, how frequently the data should be collected, at what level of detail, master data sets, data dictionaries, use the same term. Somebody has to start. And it's a huge undertaking, but I think that's where you have to start. The technology that's out there is absolutely incredible. It's great technology. But again, what we feed into that technology is where we're stumbling right now. We haven't really made great advances in data quality, in my opinion. We've gotten a lot more data. We've made great advances in technology. And now we just need to come up with the feeder to that technology and make improvements.
Yeah. And of course, the only worse answer than, what was it, one individual person or the blank stare or IT, the other worst thing, and we hear this a lot around risk. Well, who is responsible for data quality? Everyone, which in my mind always triggers, that means no one is responsible for data quality.
Exactly.
As we start to wind down our time, Joe, I want to come to you first, and then Alex, I'll ask you the same question. On theme here, we like to wrap each of these episodes with something actionable. So if I can ask you, Joe, to sort of share the love, what's a piece of advice that you would like to leave listeners with on this idea of data stewardship and data quality?
One of the challenges, and I'll just go back to what I just said previously here, assign someone the role of owning the data. And that has a wide, or could have a wide definition, but you start there. I think we also need to look at, what are our data sources that we're using today? Are they effective? Are they helping us really make decisions? Or are we just using them to kind of support a decision independent of the data? And if we're going to move towards a data driven, we have to flip that. So I think you start with creating a person or a position to look at it. You start with establishing governance. Do a data audit. I mean, that's not an IT audit. It's a data audit. And find out what you really have. You're making major decisions. Well, I shouldn't say major, tactical and major decisions every day based on data. And if the data is wrong, you're going to make the wrong decision. And therefore, your organization may or may not survive in a data-driven world. So data is an asset. Look at it as an asset. Put the proper resources and controls around that asset and leverage the asset. That's very important.
Absolutely. And Alex, how about you? What piece of advice would you like to leave listeners with?
So a bit similar, I'd say we really need to go out and build a data roadmap, how you're going to improve the quality, the access to it, and really make data due diligence part of any technology buying cycle. And I know no one likes controls, but it's so important here. So I think one part of that is you can have one person, they can be an expert in the department that's designated if you want to speed it up, that's really going to assess and advise on data. And I think any kind of RFP needs to have a section that really goes in depth. And if you need to bring in a consultant or there's a vendor you trust on how to assess the data implications of the technology, I think that needs to be much more prevalent. We rarely see that other than basic things. You have this type of information, how's your reporting, but really understanding the nuts and bolts, that needs to be part of RFPs and it needs to be given its due weighting.
Yeah, I just reinforce that comment. Our studies show that only about 30% of RFQs, RFIs, RFPs contain a data requirement.
Wow.
And as Alex is saying, the vast majority do not. And the data discussion usually takes place after the award of the contract. And then the requirements are spelled out and the supplier may or may not be willing to provide the data, may or may not be capable of providing the data at the level you want or the frequency you want. So I second Alex's comment that it has to be part of the RF process. The data requirements clearly spelled out so you know what you're going to get into.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned before with the master data management. It's almost never part of the evaluation. It's something that they realize after they purchase us and they're deploying. They say, oh, we can do that too? Well, that would really help solve this problem. There are probably a lot of other companies that didn't think about that and aren't even aware that they could have solved that issue.
Yeah.
And moving that sooner in the process, making it a bigger part of the conversation. I think that's a great place for procurement to start, an action we can take, questions we can ask, and moving that sooner in the process certainly seems to offer benefits. So Alex and Joe, thank you both so much for being with me today.